Question 1. Benchmark analysis indicates that an individual licensed to carry a handgun in Oklahoma is walking in a public park. The handgun is in a holster on their hip, and while the holster is visible, the grip of the handgun protrudes slightly above the top edge of the holster, making a small portion of the handgun visible. Considering Oklahoma Statutes Title 21, Section 1272, which of the following approaches best reflects compliance with the law regarding the manner of carry? Option A. The handgun is considered concealed because it is primarily within a holster, and the slight protrusion is incidental. Option B. The handgun is considered illegally carried because any visibility of the handgun, even a small portion, automatically constitutes a violation. Option C. The handgun is considered openly carried as the holster and a portion of the handgun are visible, thus not fully concealed from ordinary view. Option D. The handgun is considered concealed because the individual possesses a handgun license, negating the need to strictly adhere to visibility definitions. Correct answer is C. The handgun is considered openly carried as the holster and a portion of the handgun are visible, thus not fully concealed from ordinary view. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the nuanced requirements of Oklahoma's handgun licensing laws, while also considering the ethical implications of their actions. The core difficulty lies in accurately interpreting and applying the statutory definitions of concealed and open carry to a specific, real-world situation, ensuring compliance with the law without overstepping personal boundaries or creating unnecessary risk. Careful judgment is required to avoid potential legal repercussions and to uphold responsible firearm ownership principles. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding of Oklahoma Statutes Title 21, Section 1272, which defines concealed handgun as a handgun carried in such a manner as to be hidden from ordinary view. This approach correctly prioritizes adherence to the explicit legal definition. By understanding that Oklahoma law permits both concealed and open carry under specific conditions, and by ensuring that any carried handgun is either fully concealed or openly displayed according to legal parameters, an individual demonstrates responsible compliance. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the statutory framework governing handgun carry in Oklahoma, minimizing the risk of violating the law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that any visible portion of a handgun constitutes open carry, regardless of the overall manner of concealment. This fails to account for the legal definition of concealed, which focuses on being hidden from ordinary view. Another incorrect approach is to believe that simply having a permit automatically grants unrestricted freedom to carry a handgun in any manner, including partially concealed. This overlooks the specific definitions and regulations surrounding different carry methods. Finally, an approach that relies on personal interpretation of what looks safe or legal, without consulting the specific Oklahoma statutes, is fundamentally flawed. This disregards the objective legal standards and introduces subjective judgment where objective compliance is required, potentially leading to unintentional violations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the relevant jurisdiction's laws, in this case, Oklahoma statutes. They must then meticulously research and understand the specific definitions and requirements related to the activity in question, such as the definitions of concealed and open carry. When faced with ambiguity, seeking clarification from official sources or legal counsel is paramount. The decision-making process should prioritize strict adherence to the letter of the law, supplemented by an understanding of the underlying intent and ethical considerations of responsible firearm ownership. Question 2. Governance review demonstrates that an individual in Oklahoma is seeking a handgun license and needs to fulfill the proficiency requirement. Considering the specific statutes governing handgun licenses in Oklahoma, which of the following actions best represents the legally compliant and professionally advisable method for demonstrating the required handgun proficiency? Option A. Rely on personal experience of owning and handling firearms, along with a general understanding of gun safety, as sufficient proof of proficiency. Option B. Submit documentation of extensive prior military or law enforcement firearms training, assuming it automatically meets the Oklahoma proficiency standard without further OSBI review. Option C. Obtain a notarized letter from a personal acquaintance who can attest to the applicant's marksmanship skills and safe firearm handling. Option D. Enroll in and successfully complete a firearms safety and training course that is recognized and approved by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI, for handgun license applicants. The correct answer is D. Enroll in and successfully complete a firearms safety and training course that is recognized and approved by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI, for handgun license applicants. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual seeking a handgun license in Oklahoma to navigate the specific requirements for demonstrating proficiency, balancing the need for practical skill with the legal mandates. Misinterpreting or failing to meet these requirements can lead to denial of the license, impacting an individual's legal right to carry a handgun. Careful judgment is required to ensure all aspects of the proficiency demonstration are understood and met according to Oklahoma law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves understanding that Oklahoma law, specifically Oklahoma Statutes Title 21, Section 1290(10), outlines the acceptable methods for demonstrating handgun proficiency. This includes successful completion of a firearms safety and training course or program conducted by a qualified instructor, or demonstrating proficiency through other means as approved by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI. Therefore, the approach that aligns with this is to actively seek out and complete a recognized firearms safety and training course that meets the OSBI criteria for handgun license applicants. This directly addresses the statutory requirement for demonstrated proficiency in a manner that is legally recognized and verifiable. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that prior military or law enforcement firearms training automatically satisfies the Oklahoma handgun license proficiency requirement without any further verification or specific OSBI approval. While such training is often extensive, Oklahoma law requires specific documentation or a determination by the OSBI that the prior training is equivalent to the mandated course. Relying solely on past experience without formal recognition can lead to an incomplete application. Another incorrect approach is to believe that simply owning a handgun and having some familiarity with its operation is sufficient to demonstrate proficiency. Oklahoma law mandates a structured demonstration of proficiency, typically through a formal course, to ensure a baseline level of safety and competency. Personal familiarity, while important, does not meet the legal standard for a handgun license. A further incorrect approach is to attempt to bypass the formal proficiency demonstration by submitting a self-assessment or a letter from a friend attesting to one's shooting ability. Oklahoma statutes are clear on the requirement for a formal, recognized method of demonstrating proficiency, and informal attestations are not legally acceptable for this purpose. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should adopt a proactive and compliant approach. This involves thoroughly researching the specific requirements outlined by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI, for handgun license applicants. The primary step should be to identify and enroll in an approved firearms safety and training course. If an applicant believes their prior military or law enforcement experience might qualify, they should proactively contact the OSBI to understand the specific documentation and approval process for such equivalency. The decision-making process should prioritize adherence to statutory requirements and official guidance to ensure a successful application. Question 3. Cost-benefit analysis shows that obtaining and maintaining an Oklahoma handgun license involves fees and training time. Considering the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, which approach best balances the legal requirements for carrying a handgun in Oklahoma with the practical considerations of frequent travel within the state. Option A. Carry a handgun without a license, relying on the assumption that reciprocity agreements with other states automatically permit carrying within Oklahoma without an Oklahoma license. Option B. Carry a handgun without a license, based on a personal assessment of self-defense needs and a belief that the licensing process is overly burdensome. Option C. Obtain and maintain a valid Oklahoma handgun license, ensuring compliance with all training and renewal requirements, regardless of travel frequency within Oklahoma. Option D. Carry a handgun without a license, assuming it is permissible due to being an Oklahoma resident and only traveling within the state. The correct answer is C. Obtain and maintain a valid Oklahoma handgun license, ensuring compliance with all training and renewal requirements, regardless of travel frequency within Oklahoma. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance personal convenience with strict adherence to Oklahoma's firearm licensing regulations. The temptation to carry a handgun without the proper license, especially when frequently traveling across state lines, can be significant. However, failing to comply with licensing requirements carries serious legal and ethical consequences, impacting not only the individual, but also potentially the perception of responsible gun ownership. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions are within the bounds of Oklahoma law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves understanding and strictly adhering to Oklahoma's handgun licensing requirements, even when traveling. This means obtaining a valid Oklahoma handgun license before carrying a handgun in the state, regardless of frequency of travel or perceived personal risk. Oklahoma law, as outlined in the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, mandates that individuals must possess a handgun license to carry a handgun concealed or openly in most public places. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and responsible firearm handling, which are paramount ethical and legal obligations for any licensed handgun owner in Oklahoma. Incorrect approaches analysis. Carrying a handgun without a license, assuming it is permissible because the individual is a resident and only travels within Oklahoma, is a direct violation of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act. This act clearly states the requirement for a license to carry a handgun. The frequency of travel within the state or the perceived low risk does not negate this legal obligation. Carrying a handgun without a license, believing that reciprocity agreements with other states automatically grant permission to carry in Oklahoma without an Oklahoma license, is also a failure. While Oklahoma has reciprocity agreements, these typically allow Oklahoma license holders to carry in other states that recognize the license, and vice versa. They do not waive the requirement for an Oklahoma resident to possess an Oklahoma license to carry within Oklahoma. Carrying a handgun without a license, based on a personal interpretation of self-defense needs and the belief that the law is overly burdensome, represents a significant ethical and legal failure. Personal interpretations of the law cannot override statutory requirements. Responsible gun ownership demands adherence to the established legal framework, which is designed to ensure public safety and accountability. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach situations involving firearm regulations with a commitment to understanding and complying with all applicable laws. This involves proactive research into licensing requirements, understanding the scope of those licenses, and staying informed about any changes in legislation. When in doubt, seeking clarification from official sources, such as the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation (OSBI) or legal counsel, is crucial. The decision-making process should always prioritize legal compliance and ethical conduct over personal convenience or assumptions. Question 4. Implementation of responsible firearm practices in Oklahoma requires a clear understanding of prohibited actions. If an individual who possesses a valid Oklahoma handgun license consumes alcoholic beverages at a social gathering, what is the legally and ethically sound course of action regarding carrying their handgun? Option A. Carry the handgun, as the law only prohibits carrying if the individual is demonstrably causing a disturbance or posing an immediate threat. Option B. Refrain from carrying the handgun entirely while any alcohol has been consumed, regardless of perceived sobriety. Option C. Carry the handgun but keep it concealed and avoid any interaction that might draw attention. Option D. Carry the handgun but exercise extreme caution, and only if the individual feels they are not significantly impaired. The correct answer is B. Refrain from carrying the handgun entirely while any alcohol has been consumed, regardless of perceived sobriety. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the nuances of Oklahoma's firearm laws, specifically concerning the carrying of a handgun in a public place while under the influence of alcohol. The core difficulty lies in understanding the precise legal definitions and prohibitions, as well as the ethical implications of potentially endangering oneself and others. Misinterpreting these laws can lead to severe legal consequences, including arrest and criminal charges, and compromise public safety. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Oklahoma Statute Title 21, Section 1272, which explicitly prohibits carrying a handgun while under the influence of intoxicating beverages. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and public safety by recognizing that impairment significantly compromises judgment and the ability to safely handle a firearm. It involves abstaining from carrying a handgun when consuming alcohol, regardless of the perceived level of intoxication or the individual's self-assessment of their ability to handle a weapon. This aligns with the ethical responsibility of all licensed handgun carriers to act in a manner that does not pose a risk to themselves or the community. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that a slight or manageable level of intoxication does not violate the law, believing that one can still safely carry a handgun. This fails to recognize that Oklahoma law does not provide a threshold for acceptable intoxication when carrying a handgun. Any level of impairment while carrying is prohibited. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on personal judgment about one's ability to handle a firearm, disregarding the legal prohibition. This is a dangerous ethical and legal failure, as personal judgment can be clouded by alcohol, and the law is designed to prevent such subjective assessments from leading to potential harm. A third incorrect approach is to believe that if no immediate threat is perceived, carrying a handgun while intoxicated is permissible. This ignores the proactive nature of the law, which aims to prevent potential incidents before they occur by removing firearms from individuals whose judgment is compromised. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Oklahoma should adopt a zero-tolerance mindset regarding alcohol consumption and handgun carry. The decision-making framework should be, if alcohol has been consumed, do not carry a handgun. This simple rule, grounded in Oklahoma Statute Title 21, Section 1272, eliminates ambiguity and ensures compliance with the law and ethical responsibilities. When in doubt, err on the side of caution and leave the handgun secured. Question 5. To address the challenge of lawful concealed handgun carry in Oklahoma, if a licensed individual is lawfully stopped by a law enforcement officer for a minor traffic violation and the officer has not yet inquired about the presence of a firearm, what is the most appropriate course of action according to Oklahoma law? Option A. Refuse to answer any questions about the presence of a handgun, citing your right to privacy. Option B. Assume the officer has no right to inquire about the firearm due to your concealed handgun license and act accordingly. Option C. Remain calm, comply with lawful instructions, and only disclose the presence of the handgun if specifically asked by the officer or if the situation necessitates it for safety. Option D. Immediately inform the officer that you are a licensed handgun carrier and that you have a firearm on your person. The correct answer is C. Remain calm, comply with lawful instructions, and only disclose the presence of the handgun if specifically asked by the officer or if the situation necessitates it for safety. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the nuances of Oklahoma's firearm laws, specifically concerning the carrying of a handgun in a public place, while also considering the potential for misinterpretation or overreach by law enforcement. The core challenge lies in understanding the precise conditions under which a concealed handgun license, CCL, holder can legally carry a handgun, and what constitutes a lawful interaction with law enforcement when carrying. Misunderstanding these provisions can lead to unnecessary legal complications or perceived threats. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves understanding and adhering strictly to Oklahoma Statutes Title 21, Section 1290, 1 et sec, which governs the carrying of concealed handguns by licensed individuals. This approach prioritizes knowledge of the law, particularly regarding prohibited places and the requirements for interaction with law enforcement. Specifically, a CCL holder is permitted to carry a concealed handgun in most public places, provided they are not in a location explicitly prohibited by Statute e.g., schools, courthouses, polling places on election day, correctional facilities, etc. Furthermore, Oklahoma law does not mandate that a CCL holder proactively inform a law enforcement officer they are carrying a handgun unless specifically asked, or if the officer has a lawful reason to detain them. The correct response is to remain calm, comply with lawful orders, and only disclose the presence of the firearm if legally required or if the situation warrants it for safety. This aligns with the principle of lawful concealed carry and responsible interaction with law enforcement. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately inform the officer of the handgun without any prompting or lawful basis for detention. While seemingly cooperative, this action is not legally required by Oklahoma CHL statutes and could potentially escalate a routine traffic stop into a more tense situation than necessary, especially if the officer is not accustomed to such proactive disclosures. It deviates from the specific requirements of the law. Another incorrect approach is to refuse to acknowledge the presence of the handgun if asked by the officer, or to become defensive. Oklahoma law requires a CHL holder to permit the officer to inspect their license and handgun if the officer has a lawful reason to detain them. Denying the presence of the firearm or being uncooperative when lawfully asked to disclose it is a violation of the law and can lead to immediate legal consequences, including arrest and revocation of the CHL. A third incorrect approach is to assume that being a CHL holder grants immunity from all lawful searches or inquiries by law enforcement. While a CHL holder has the right to carry a concealed handgun, this right does not exempt them from lawful detention, investigation, or search if an officer has reasonable suspicion or probable cause of criminal activity. Acting as if the CHL provides absolute protection from any law enforcement interaction is a dangerous misinterpretation of the law. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Oklahoma carrying a handgun under a CHL must adopt a decision-making process rooted in a thorough understanding of Oklahoma Statutes Title 21, Section 1290, 1 et sec. This involves continuous education on legal requirements, prohibited locations, and the specific protocols for interacting with law enforcement. The framework should prioritize lawful compliance, de-escalation, and accurate knowledge of one's rights and responsibilities. When encountering law enforcement, the professional should remain calm, assess the situation to determine if the detention is lawful, and respond truthfully and cooperatively to lawful requests, while also being aware of when disclosure is legally mandated. Question 6. The review process indicates a need to clarify the legal parameters for carrying a handgun in Oklahoma when an individual chooses not to obtain a handgun license. Considering the optional nature of the license, what is the most prudent and legally compliant approach for an Oklahoma resident who is at least 21 years old, has no felony convictions, and wishes to carry a handgun? Option A. Assume that since a handgun license is optional, any method of carrying a handgun is permissible as long as the individual is over 21 and has no felony convictions. Option B. Rely on common knowledge and the practices observed among friends and acquaintances regarding the legality of carrying a handgun without a license. Option C. Carry the handgun in a manner that is most convenient, without specific consideration for whether it is openly or concealed, as long as the individual meets the basic age and criminal record requirements. Option D. Carry the handgun openly or concealed, ensuring compliance with all specific prohibitions outlined in Oklahoma Statutes Title 21, Section 1272, such as not carrying in certain government buildings or schools, and not being under the influence of alcohol or controlled substances. The correct answer is D. Carry the handgun openly or concealed, ensuring compliance with all specific prohibitions outlined in Oklahoma Statutes Title 21, Section 1272, such as not carrying in certain government buildings or schools, and not being under the influence of alcohol or controlled substances. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the nuances of Oklahoma's firearm laws concerning the carrying of handguns, specifically when a license is not mandatory but certain conditions apply. The challenge lies in accurately interpreting the legal requirements for carrying a handgun openly or concealed without a license, distinguishing between permissible and prohibited action, and understanding the implications of carrying in specific locations. Careful judgment is required to avoid violating state statutes, which could lead to legal repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Oklahoma Statutes Title 21, Section 1272, which outlines the conditions under which a person may carry a handgun, either openly or concealed, without a handgun license. This approach prioritizes accurate legal knowledge and responsible behavior by ensuring the individual meets all statutory requirements, such as being at least 21 years of age, not being a convicted felon, and not being prohibited from possessing a firearm under federal or state law. This aligns with the principle of lawful self-defense and responsible firearm ownership as permitted by Oklahoma law. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that because a handgun license is optional, any method of carrying a handgun is permissible as long as the individual is over 21. This fails to recognize that Oklahoma law, while making licensing optional, still imposes specific conditions and restrictions on carrying a handgun without a license, particularly concerning carrying in certain prohibited locations or under circumstances that could be construed as threatening. Another incorrect approach is to rely on anecdotal information or the practices of others regarding handgun carry laws. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the definitive legal framework established by Oklahoma statutes. Misinformation or assumptions about legal carry can lead to unintentional violations, even if the intent was to act lawfully. A further incorrect approach is to carry a handgun in a manner that could be perceived as overtly aggressive or threatening, even if technically within the bounds of open carry. While open carry may be permitted under certain conditions, the manner of carry can still be subject to interpretation and may lead to interactions with law enforcement or public concern, potentially creating legal complications or escalating situations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a commitment to understanding and complying with all applicable state laws. This involves consulting official legal resources, such as the Oklahoma statutes, and seeking clarification from legal counsel or law enforcement if any aspect of the law is unclear. The framework should emphasize responsible firearm ownership, prioritizing safety, and avoiding actions that could be misconstrued or lead to legal entanglements. When in doubt, it is always best to err on the side of caution and ensure full compliance with the letter and spirit of the law. Question 7. Examination of the data shows that an individual in Oklahoma has recently obtained a provisional handgun license. While driving, they are lawfully stopped by a police officer for a minor traffic infraction. The officer notices the individual's demeanor and asks if they are carrying a handgun. The individual confirms they are carrying a concealed handgun, as permitted by their provisional license. What is the most professional and legally sound course of action for the individual in this situation? Option A. Become defensive and immediately assert their right to carry without question, refusing to provide any information or documentation to the officer. Option B. Attempt to de-escalate by stating they are not carrying a handgun, hoping the officer will not pursue the matter further. Option C. Calmly inform the officer they are carrying a concealed handgun, present their provisional handgun license when requested, and be prepared to explain its validity and any specific terms or conditions associated with it. Option D. Assume the provisional license grants all the same rights as a full license and simply state they are carrying a handgun, without offering further details or documentation unless explicitly demanded. The correct answer is C. Calmly inform the officer they are carrying a concealed handgun, present their provisional handgun license when requested, and be prepared to explain its validity and any specific terms or conditions associated with it. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the nuances of Oklahoma's firearm laws, specifically concerning the carrying of handguns, while also considering the potential for misinterpretation or overreach by law enforcement. The core challenge lies in understanding the scope of permissible actions under a provisional handgun license and distinguishing between lawful conduct and potential violations, especially when interacting with an officer who may not be fully aware of the specific provisions of a provisional license. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves understanding the precise limitations and permissions granted by a provisional handgun license in Oklahoma. This means recognizing that a provisional license, while allowing for concealed carry, may have specific conditions or restrictions not present in a full license. The correct approach is to be fully aware of these specific terms and conditions, including any geographical or situational limitation, and to be prepared to calmly and respectfully present the provisional license and explain its validity if questioned by law enforcement. This aligns with Oklahoma statutes that govern the issuance and use of handgun licenses, emphasizing compliance and informed self-regulation. The professional's responsibility is to know the law as it applies to their specific license status. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that a provisional license grants the same rights and privileges as a full handgun license without verifying the specific stipulations. This could lead to unknowingly violating the terms of the provisional license, such as carrying in a prohibited location or manner not permitted by the provisional status. Another incorrect approach is to become defensive or confrontational with law enforcement. Regardless of the validity of the officer's inquiry, maintaining a calm and cooperative demeanor is crucial. Escalating the situation can lead to misunderstandings and potentially more serious legal complications, even if the individual is ultimately found to be in compliance. Finally, ignoring the interaction or attempting to evade the officer is a severe error, as it can be construed as resisting arrest or obstructing an officer, regardless of the legality of the handgun possession. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive approach to understanding their licensing requirements. This involves thoroughly reviewing all documentation provided with the license, consulting official state resources for clarification on any ambiguities, and staying informed about any updates to Oklahoma's firearm laws. When interacting with law enforcement, the decision-making process should prioritize de-escalation, clear communication, and a willingness to cooperate while asserting one's rights respectfully and knowledgeably. The goal is to ensure lawful conduct and to be prepared to demonstrate that compliance if questioned. Question 8. Upon reviewing an individual's request to carry a handgun in Oklahoma, what is the most critical step to ensure compliance with the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act and responsible firearm possession? Option A. Relying on general knowledge of firearm laws without confirming current Oklahoma statutes. Option B. Accepting a handgun license from another state as sufficient proof of authorization to carry in Oklahoma. Option C. Verifying the individual meets all statutory eligibility criteria for a handgun license and has completed a state-certified handgun safety and training course. Option D. Assuming the individual's possession of a firearm implies a right to carry it openly or concealed. Correct answer is C. Verifying the individual meets all statutory eligibility criteria for a handgun license and has completed a state-certified handgun safety and training course. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a potential conflict between an individual's right to self-defense and the specific legal requirements for carrying a handgun in Oklahoma. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these requirements can lead to serious legal consequences, including criminal charges and the revocation of any existing handgun license. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Oklahoma law, which prioritizes public safety and responsible firearm ownership. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Oklahoma's statutory requirements for handgun licensing. This includes verifying that the individual meets all eligibility criteria outlined in the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, such as age, residency, and the absence of disqualifying criminal convictions or mental health adjudications. It also necessitates confirming that the individual has successfully completed a certified handgun safety and training course as mandated by state law. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legal framework established by the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, ensuring that individuals are legally permitted and adequately trained to carry a handgun. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that simply possessing a firearm grants the right to carry it openly or concealed in Oklahoma. This fails to acknowledge the specific licensing requirements and training mandates of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act. Legally carrying a handgun in Oklahoma is not an inherent right, but a privilege granted upon meeting specific statutory conditions. Another incorrect approach is to rely on outdated or informal information regarding handgun carry laws. Laws can change, and relying on hearsay or non-official sources can lead to significant legal missteps. Oklahoma law requires adherence to its current statutes, not to past practices or common misconceptions. A further incorrect approach is to believe that a valid license from another state automatically permits handgun carry in Oklahoma without verifying reciprocity agreements or specific Oklahoma requirements for non-resident carry. While reciprocity exists, it is not universal and is subject to the terms and conditions set forth by Oklahoma law. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and public safety. This involves 1. Identifying the specific jurisdiction Oklahoma and its relevant statutes, Oklahoma Self-Defense Act. 2. verifying all statutory eligibility requirements for handgun licensing. 3. Confirming completion of all mandated training. 4. Consulting official state resources for the most current legal information. 5. Understanding the implications of reciprocity with other states. This systematic approach ensures that actions are grounded in legal authority and ethical responsibility. Question 9. When evaluating the requirements for obtaining and maintaining a handgun license in Oklahoma, which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act and its associated regulations? Option A. Relying on advice from friends who have obtained handgun licenses in Oklahoma and information found on general firearm enthusiast websites. Option B. Interpreting the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act based on personal understanding of firearm rights and what seems reasonable for responsible gun ownership. Option C. Directly consulting the official text of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act and any relevant administrative rules published by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. Option D. Assuming that a valid handgun license issued by another U.S. state automatically fulfills all requirements for carrying a handgun in Oklahoma. The correct answer is C. Directly consulting the official text of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act and any relevant administrative rules published by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the nuances of Oklahoma's handgun licensing requirements while also considering the ethical implications of their actions. The core challenge lies in accurately interpreting and applying the law to a specific situation, ensuring compliance without overstepping legal boundaries or creating unnecessary complications. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between permissible actions and those that could lead to legal repercussions or compromise the integrity of the licensing process. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and direct review of the official Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, SDA, and its associated statutes and administrative rules. This approach is correct because it relies on the definitive legal source for handgun licensing in Oklahoma. By consulting the SDA directly, an individual ensures they are acting based on the most accurate and up-to-date legal requirements, thereby minimizing the risk of misinterpretation or noncompliance. This aligns with the ethical obligation to uphold the law and act with integrity in all matters related to firearm possession and licensing. Incorrect approaches analysis. Relying solely on anecdotal advice from friends or informal online forums presents a significant regulatory failure. Such sources are not authoritative and may contain outdated, inaccurate, or jurisdictionally irrelevant information. This approach risks noncompliance with the Oklahoma SDA, potentially leading to penalties. Assuming that a license from another state automatically grants the same privileges in Oklahoma is another regulatory failure. Oklahoma law, like most states, has specific reciprocity agreements or requirements for recognizing out-of-state licenses, and a blanket assumption is legally unsound. Finally, interpreting the SDA based on personal opinions or assumptions about what should be legal is a dangerous ethical and regulatory failure. Legal requirements are based on codified statutes and administrative rules, not personal beliefs, and acting on such assumptions can lead to serious legal consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to understanding legal requirements. This involves identifying the primary governing statutes and regulations. In this case, the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act. When faced with ambiguity or a need for clarification, the next step should be to consult official government resources, such as the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI website, or relevant legal counsel. Anecdotal information or personal interpretations should always be secondary to and verified against official legal sources. This methodical process ensures accuracy, compliance, and ethical conduct. Question 10. The analysis reveals that an Oklahoma handgun license holder, after completing a defensive shooting course, is contemplating the financial ramifications of a hypothetical lawful use of their firearm in self-defense. They have calculated their current monthly expenses and income. If they were to incur legal defense costs averaging $25,000 and potential civil damages of $100,000, and their current savings are $15,000, what is the minimum percentage of their current monthly income they would need to allocate to savings over the next 5 years to cover these potential liabilities? assuming no increase in income or expenses and that their savings are invested at a simple annual interest rate of 3%. Option A, approximately 15, 0%. Option B, approximately 25, 0%. Option C, approximately 35, 7%. Option D, approximately 20, 0%. Correct answer is C, approximately 35, 7%. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario where a licensed Oklahoma handgun holder is considering the financial implications of a potential self-defense incident. This is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate, potentially life-altering consequences of a defensive action with the long-term financial responsibilities that may arise, even if the use of the firearm is deemed lawful. The holder must understand that legal defense costs, civil liability, and potential loss of income can be significant, irrespective of the justification for using the handgun. Careful judgment is required to assess these risks proactively. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive understanding of potential financial liabilities and proactive risk mitigation. This includes recognizing that even lawful use of a firearm in self-defense can trigger civil lawsuits and require legal representation, incurring substantial costs. Therefore, the most prudent action is to factor in the potential for significant legal fees and civil damages into one's personal financial planning, potentially through adequate insurance coverage or by maintaining sufficient liquid assets to cover unforeseen expenses. This aligns with the ethical responsibility of a firearm license holder to be prepared for all potential ramifications of carrying a concealed weapon, not just the immediate act of defense. An incorrect approach involves solely focusing on the immediate legal justification for using the handgun, assuming that if the act is lawful, all financial consequences will be absolved. This fails to acknowledge the separate civil legal system, which can pursue damages even when criminal charges are not filed or result in acquittal. Another incorrect approach is to disregard any potential financial implications, believing that such events are too unlikely to warrant consideration. This demonstrates a lack of foresight and preparedness, which is contrary to the responsible ownership and carrying of a firearm. Finally, an approach that prioritizes immediate financial gain or recovery from a hypothetical incident over preparedness for potential liabilities is ethically unsound and professionally irresponsible. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the legal and financial landscape surrounding the lawful use of a firearm in self-defense in Oklahoma. This includes researching potential civil liability statutes, understanding the costs associated with legal defense, and assessing personal financial resilience. The framework should then involve proactive risk assessment and mitigation, such as exploring insurance options specifically designed for firearm owners or ensuring adequate personal savings. This systematic approach ensures that preparedness extends beyond the physical act of self-defense to encompass the full spectrum of potential consequences. Question 11. Comparative studies suggest that individuals carrying handguns in Oklahoma often face complex decisions regarding their legal rights and responsibilities. Considering the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, which of the following represents the most prudent and legally compliant approach when carrying a handgun in a public place? Option A. Assume that possessing a handgun license allows you to carry your firearm in any location within Oklahoma without further consideration of specific prohibitions. Option B. Openly carry the handgun in any public space, as this is generally permitted under Oklahoma law, regardless of the specific circumstances or potential for alarm. Option C. Conceal the handgun without concern for the OSTA definition of concealed and without preparing to show your license to law enforcement. Option D. Carry the handgun in compliance with all provisions of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, including any location-specific restrictions, and be prepared to present your license and identification to law enforcement upon request. The correct answer is D. Carry the handgun in compliance with all provisions of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, including any location-specific restrictions, and be prepared to present your license and identification to law enforcement upon request. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for self-defense with the legal and ethical obligations surrounding the carrying of a handgun in Oklahoma. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nuances of Oklahoma's handgun licensing laws and the responsible application of those laws in a dynamic, potentially dangerous situation. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to severe legal consequences and compromise public safety. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Oklahoma's statutes regarding the carrying of concealed or unconcealed handguns by licensed individuals. This means ensuring that the handgun is carried in compliance with all provisions of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, OSTA, including any restrictions on where a handgun may be carried, e.g., certain government buildings, schools. A licensed individual must also be prepared to present their license and identification to a law enforcement officer upon request. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legal framework established by the OSTA, which permits licensed individuals to carry handguns under specific conditions, while also emphasizing the duty to cooperate with law enforcement. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that simply possessing a handgun license automatically grants unrestricted carrying privileges in all locations within Oklahoma. This fails to acknowledge the specific prohibitions and limitations outlined in the OSTA, such as those concerning carrying firearms in courthouses or on school property, even with a license. Another incorrect approach is to conceal the handgun without ensuring it is done in a manner consistent with the OSTA definition of concealed, and to fail to be prepared to present the license and identification to law enforcement. This disregards the legal requirements for carrying and the duty to identify oneself as a license holder when lawfully asked by an officer. A further incorrect approach is to openly carry the handgun without considering whether it is permitted under the OSTA, or if it might provoke unnecessary alarm or confrontation, even if technically legal in some public spaces. While open carry may be permitted in certain circumstances, responsible decision-making requires an assessment of the context and potential consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance, situational awareness, and de-escalation. This involves 1. Knowing the specific laws of Oklahoma regarding handgun carry, including all exceptions and prohibitions. 2. Continuously assessing the immediate environment and potential threats. 3. Acting in a manner that is both legally defensible and promotes public safety. 4. Understanding that the right to carry a handgun is accompanied by significant responsibilities. Question 12. The investigation demonstrates that an Oklahoma handgun license holder feels personally uncomfortable and morally opposed to carrying their handgun in a particular public park due to recent community incidents, even though the park is not explicitly listed as a prohibited location under the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act. What is the most appropriate course of action for this licensee? Option A. Carry the handgun but remain hypervigilant and avoid interaction with others in the park due to the perceived increased risk. Option B. Refrain from carrying the handgun in the public park based on personal discomfort and moral objections, despite the location not being statutorily prohibited. Option C. Interpret the recent community incidents as creating a de facto prohibited zone, and therefore avoid carrying the handgun in the park. Option D. Continue to carry the handgun in the public park, as it is not a statutorily prohibited location, and the license permits carrying in such areas. The correct answer is D. Continue to carry the handgun in the public park, as it is not a statutorily prohibited location, and the license permits carrying in such areas. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a potential conflict between a licensee's personal beliefs and their legal obligations under Oklahoma law regarding the carrying of firearms. The licensee must navigate their right to self-defense and personal safety while adhering strictly to the regulations governing handgun licenses in Oklahoma, which are designed to ensure public safety and responsible firearm ownership. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to severe legal consequences, including license revocation and criminal charges. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice is to strictly adhere to the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act and its associated regulations regarding the carrying of handguns. This means understanding that a valid Oklahoma handgun license permits the licensee to carry a handgun in accordance with state law, regardless of personal feelings about specific locations or individuals, as long as those locations are not explicitly prohibited by statute. The licensee's personal discomfort or moral objection to being in a particular public place does not negate their legal right or responsibility to comply with the law if they choose to carry a handgun. The Oklahoma Self-Defense Act outlines specific locations where carrying a handgun is prohibited, and personal preference is not a legal exemption. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to refuse to carry a handgun in a public place solely based on personal discomfort or a subjective feeling of unease, even if the location is not statutorily prohibited for licensed carriers. This fails to recognize the legal framework established by the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, which grants licensed individuals the right to carry in most public places. The law is designed to provide a means of self-defense, and personal feelings, while valid, do not override legal permissions and restrictions. Another incorrect approach is to interpret personal moral objections as a legal basis to avoid carrying a handgun in a public place, even when legally permitted. This conflates personal ethics with legal requirements. While individuals are free to make personal choices about carrying firearms, these choices must be informed by and compliant with the law. The Oklahoma Self-Defense Act does not provide exemptions based on subjective moral judgments about public spaces. A third incorrect approach is to assume that a general sense of unease in a public area constitutes a legal prohibition against carrying a handgun. Oklahoma law specifies particular locations where carrying is prohibited, e.g., courthouses, polling places on election day, schools. A generalized feeling of discomfort does not equate to these statutory prohibitions. Licensed individuals are expected to know and abide by the specific legal restrictions, not to create their own based on subjective perceptions. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must develop a decision-making process rooted in a thorough understanding of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act and related statutes. This involves prioritizing legal compliance above personal feelings or subjective interpretations of safety. When faced with a situation where personal comfort conflicts with legal rights and responsibilities, the professional must consult the specific provisions of the law. If there is any doubt about the legality of carrying a handgun in a particular location, seeking clarification from legal counsel or the relevant state authorities is the prudent course of action. The core principle is to act within the bounds of the law, ensuring that personal choices do not lead to violations of Oklahoma's firearm regulations. Question 13. Analysis of a situation in Oklahoma where a licensed handgun carrier experiences a personal moral conflict regarding the carrying of a firearm on a particular day. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensee? Option A. Abstain from carrying the handgun if personal moral beliefs conflict with the act of carrying it on that specific occasion. Option B. Carry the handgun selectively, only when personal moral beliefs align with the act of carrying it. Option C. Carry the handgun openly, as personal moral objections might make concealed carry feel inappropriate. Option D. Interpret personal moral objections as a valid reason to disregard specific provisions of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act for that day. The correct answer is A. Abstain from carrying the handgun if personal moral beliefs conflict with the act of carrying it on that specific occasion. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a licensee's personal beliefs and their legal obligations under Oklahoma law regarding the carrying of firearms. The licensee must navigate their moral compass while adhering strictly to the regulations governing handgun licenses, which are designed to ensure public safety and responsible firearm ownership. Failure to do so can result in severe legal and professional consequences. The challenge lies in making a decision that upholds the law without compromising personal integrity, but prioritizing legal compliance is paramount in this context. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves understanding that a handgun license in Oklahoma is a legal authorization to carry a concealed handgun under specific conditions. It does not grant discretion to refuse to carry a handgun based on personal moral objections when legally permitted to do so. Therefore, the licensee must comply with the legal requirements of their license. This means if they choose to carry a handgun under their license, they must do so in accordance with Oklahoma statutes. If their personal beliefs prevent them from carrying a handgun, the legally and ethically sound decision is to not carry the handgun at all, rather than to selectively ignore the law. The Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, OSTA, and its associated statutes define the rights and responsibilities of a licensee. The OSTA does not provide an exemption for personal moral objections to carrying a handgun when otherwise legally authorized. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to selectively carry a handgun only when it aligns with personal moral beliefs, while disregarding the license when it does not. This constitutes a violation of the terms of the handgun license, as it implies carrying a concealed handgun without being in full compliance with the OSTA. Selective compliance undermines the regulatory framework designed for public safety and responsible firearm possession. Another incorrect approach is to carry a handgun in a manner that deviates from the specific requirements outlined in the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, such as carrying it openly when the license is for concealed carry, or carrying it in a prohibited location. This demonstrates a lack of understanding or disregard for the legal parameters of the license, potentially leading to criminal charges and revocation of the license. A further incorrect approach is to believe that personal moral objections supersede legal requirements for carrying a handgun under a license. While personal beliefs are important, they do not grant a licensee the authority to ignore or selectively apply state laws. The Oklahoma handgun license system is based on statutory authority, not individual moral interpretation. Professional reasoning. Professionals in roles involving regulated activities, such as carrying a handgun under a license, must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance above all else. This involves a thorough understanding of the relevant statutes and regulations. When faced with a conflict between personal beliefs and legal obligations, the professional must first ascertain the precise legal requirements. If personal beliefs fundamentally conflict with these requirements, the professional course of action is to abstain from the regulated activity entirely, rather than attempting to operate in a manner that is not fully compliant with the law. This ensures accountability, upholds the integrity of the regulatory system, and protects both the individual and the public. Question 14. Consider a scenario where you are walking to your vehicle in a dimly lit parking lot in Oklahoma and notice two individuals loitering near your car, exhibiting agitated behavior and speaking loudly. What is the most prudent course of action to ensure your safety and comply with Oklahoma's handgun licensing regulations? Option A. Continue walking directly towards your vehicle, ignoring the individuals and their behavior, as you are legally licensed to carry a handgun. Option B. Immediately draw your handgun and confront the individuals, demanding they identify themselves and their purpose. Option C. Approach the individuals directly and ask them in a confrontational tone if they are causing trouble. Option D. Maintain situational awareness, discreetly assess the individual's behavior for immediate threats, and if a safe opportunity arises, move away from the area or seek a more secure location without direct confrontation. The correct answer is D. Maintain situational awareness, discreetly assess the individual's behavior for immediate threats, and if a safe opportunity arises, move away from the area or seek a more secure location without direct confrontation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a handgun in Oklahoma. The core difficulty lies in accurately assessing a threat and determining the appropriate, lawful response, which can be influenced by emotional stress and the immediacy of the situation. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and the loss of the handgun license. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice in this situation involves de-escalation and avoidance of confrontation whenever possible, while maintaining situational awareness. This approach prioritizes personal safety through vigilance and strategic retreat if a safe opportunity exists, rather than immediate engagement. Oklahoma law, while permitting the carrying of a handgun by licensed individuals, does not mandate its use in every perceived threat. The ethical and legal imperative is to use deadly force only as a last resort when facing an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. This approach aligns with the principle of proportionality in the use of force and the legal standard for self-defense in Oklahoma. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately draw the handgun and confront the individuals, assuming a hostile intent based solely on their presence and perceived demeanor. This fails to meet the legal threshold for imminent threat and could be construed as an aggressive act, potentially leading to charges of assault or brandishing a weapon. It bypasses the opportunity for de-escalation or avoidance, which are legally and ethically preferred. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the individuals and continue on the same path without any attempt to assess the situation or create distance. While avoidance is a component of the correct approach, this specific action, if it involves remaining in a potentially dangerous proximity without any defensive posture or awareness, could be seen as a failure to take reasonable steps to ensure personal safety when a potential threat is present. It neglects the duty to be aware of one's surroundings, which is a fundamental aspect of responsible handgun carry. A further incorrect approach is to verbally challenge the individuals aggressively, demanding to know their intentions. This escalates the situation unnecessarily and can provoke a violent response. It moves away from de-escalation and towards confrontation, increasing the risk of harm to oneself and others, and is not a legally sanctioned method of threat assessment or self-defense. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes threat assessment, de-escalation, and avoidance. This involves maintaining constant situational awareness, observing behavior for indicators of intent, and creating distance or seeking cover if a threat is perceived. The decision to draw or use a firearm should only be made when there is an imminent and unavoidable threat of death or great bodily harm, and all other reasonable options have been exhausted. This framework is grounded in Oklahoma statutes regarding self-defense and the responsible carrying of firearms. Question 15. During the evaluation of a potential carry location in Oklahoma, what is the most prudent course of action for an individual possessing a valid Oklahoma handgun license to ensure compliance with state regulations? Option A. Proceed to carry the handgun, relying on the assumption that law enforcement will exercise discretion if a violation occurs. Option B. Carry the handgun without a license, believing that personal discretion supersedes state licensing requirements for self-defense. Option C. Confirm the location is not a prohibited place under Oklahoma law and that the individual possesses a valid Oklahoma handgun license. Option D. Assume that a valid Oklahoma handgun license permits carrying a handgun in any public location within the state. The correct answer is C. Confirm the location is not a prohibited place under Oklahoma law and that the individual possesses a valid Oklahoma handgun license. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for self-defense with the legal and ethical obligations surrounding the carrying of a handgun in Oklahoma. The core challenge lies in understanding the nuances of Oklahoma's handgun licensing laws, particularly concerning the permissible locations for carrying a concealed or unconcealed handgun, and the potential consequences of misinterpreting these regulations. Careful judgment is required to avoid violating state law, which could lead to criminal charges and the revocation of any existing license. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Oklahoma statutes Title 21, Section 1272, etc., which govern the carrying of firearms. Specifically, an individual must be aware of the restrictions on carrying firearms in certain locations, such as schools, courthouses, and polling places on Election Day, as well as the requirement to possess a valid Oklahoma handgun license to carry a concealed or unconcealed handgun in most public places. Therefore, the correct approach is to confirm that the location is not a prohibited place under Oklahoma law, and that the individual possesses the necessary license before carrying a handgun. This aligns with the legal framework designed to ensure public safety while respecting the rights of licensed individuals. Incorrect approach is analysis. Carrying a handgun into a location without first verifying it is not a prohibited place under Oklahoma law, even with a valid license, is a regulatory failure. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for specific statutory restrictions. Relying solely on the assumption that a valid license grants unrestricted carry privileges across all public spaces in Oklahoma is a significant legal misinterpretation, as the law explicitly carves out exceptions for certain sensitive locations. Furthermore, carrying a handgun without a license, or in a manner that violates the terms of the license, e.g., concealed when only permitted unconcealed, or vice versa, if applicable under specific circumstances not detailed here but generally understood within licensing frameworks, is a direct violation of Oklahoma law and constitutes a serious ethical and legal breach. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and risk mitigation. This involves 1. Understanding the specific laws of the jurisdiction Oklahoma regarding firearms. 2. Verifying the legality of carrying a firearm in a particular location by consulting relevant statutes or official guidance. 3. Ensuring all necessary permits or licenses are current and valid. 4. Acting with caution and erring on the side of legal compliance when in doubt. Question 16. Research into Oklahoma's self-defense statutes indicates that a licensed handgun carrier, while lawfully carrying their firearm, encounters an individual aggressively approaching them in a dimly lit parking lot, shouting threats of physical harm. The individual's hands are not visible. What is the most prudent course of action to align with Oklahoma's legal framework for justifiable use of force? Option A. Retreat from the situation without engaging, even if it means exposing oneself to further danger, as any confrontation could be misconstrued as aggression. Option B. Immediately draw the handgun and issue a verbal warning, assuming the aggressive demeanor and threats constitute an immediate and unavoidable threat requiring preemptive action. Option C. Confront the individual verbally to ascertain their intentions, even if it means closing the distance and potentially escalating the confrontation. Option D. Assess the immediate threat based on the totality of the circumstances. Prioritize de-escalation and avoidance if safely possible, and be prepared to use the firearm only if there is a reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, and no lesser force is sufficient. The correct answer is D. Assess the immediate threat based on the totality of the circumstances. Prioritize de-escalation and avoidance if safely possible, and be prepared to use the firearm only if there is a reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, and no lesser force is sufficient. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a handgun in Oklahoma. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing a threat and determining if the use of deadly force is legally justified and ethically sound, while also considering the potential legal ramifications of their actions. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and ethical dilemmas regarding the sanctity of life. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Oklahoma's self-defense laws, specifically focusing on the Castle Doctrine and the legal definitions of imminent danger and reasonable fear. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of conflict whenever safely possible, recognizing that the use of a handgun is a last resort. It requires the individual to be able to articulate, based on the totality of the circumstances, why they reasonably believe they were in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, and that no lesser force was sufficient to repel the threat. This aligns with Oklahoma Statutes Title 21, Section 1289, 25, which outlines justifiable use of force. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that simply possessing a handgun license in Oklahoma grants an unrestricted right to use the firearm in any situation perceived as threatening. This fails to acknowledge the legal standards for justifiable use of force, which require an objective assessment of imminent danger and the necessity of deadly force. It overlooks the crucial distinction between carrying a firearm legally and using it legally. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on a subjective feeling of fear without a reasonable basis in the observable circumstances. Oklahoma law requires that the fear be reasonable, meaning a prudent person in the same situation would also fear for their life or safety. Acting solely on an unsubstantiated feeling, without concrete evidence of a threat, would not meet the legal threshold for self-defense. A further incorrect approach is to engage in aggressive or confrontational behavior that escalates a situation, thereby creating or exacerbating the perceived threat. While the right to self-defense exists, it does not extend to initiating or provoking a conflict and then claiming self-defense. Responsible gun ownership in Oklahoma emphasizes avoiding confrontation and using force only when absolutely necessary to prevent serious harm. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with threat assessment. This involves objectively evaluating the situation. Is there an immediate and unlawful threat of death or great bodily harm? What are the available options for escape or de-escalation? If force is deemed necessary, is it proportionate to the threat? This framework emphasizes adherence to legal statutes ethical considerations regarding the use of deadly force, and a commitment to responsible firearm handling and storage. Continuous training and a deep understanding of Oklahoma's self-defense laws are paramount. Question 17. The audit findings indicate that a recent applicant for a handgun license in Oklahoma has a past arrest record that includes a charge that was later dismissed. What is the most appropriate risk assessment approach to determine the applicant's eligibility for a handgun license under Oklahoma law? Option A. Rely on the applicant's verbal assurance that their past legal issues are fully resolved and do not impact their current eligibility without further investigation. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the applicant's criminal history, specifically examining whether the dismissed charge or any other aspect of their record falls under the disqualifying criteria outlined in the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, and verify the dismissal status. Option C. Deny the handgun license application based on the mere fact of a past arrest, regardless of the charge's dismissal or the specific provisions of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act. Option D. Immediately approve the handgun license application because the charge was dismissed, signifying no conviction and therefore no legal impediment. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the applicant's criminal history, specifically examining whether the dismissed charge or any other aspect of their record falls under the disqualifying criteria outlined in the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, and verify the dismissal status. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential lapse in adherence to Oklahoma's laws regarding the carrying of handguns. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act (OSTA) and its implications for individuals who may have had prior interactions with law enforcement, even if those interactions did not result in a conviction. The challenge lies in interpreting the OSTA disqualifying factors accurately and applying them to a specific individual's history, ensuring compliance without infringing on legal rights. Careful judgment is required to balance the need for public safety with the rights of individuals to possess a handgun license. The best approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's criminal history, specifically looking for any disqualifying offenses as defined by the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act. This includes not only convictions, but also certain arrests and charges that, under Oklahoma law, can prevent an individual from obtaining or retaining a handgun license. The OSTA explicitly outlines these disqualifications, and a responsible assessment must directly address whether the applicant's history falls within these prohibited categories. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the statutory requirements for handgun licensing in Oklahoma, prioritizing legal compliance and public safety as mandated by the OSTA. It ensures that the licensing process is conducted according to the established legal framework. An approach that dismisses the applicant's history based solely on the absence of a recent conviction is incorrect. The OSTA disqualifying factors are not limited to convictions. Certain arrests and pending charges can also serve as grounds for denial or revocation of a license. Failing to investigate these further can lead to a violation of Oklahoma law. Another incorrect approach is to rely on informal assurances from the applicant that their past issues are resolved without independent verification. The OSTA requires a formal assessment of an applicant's eligibility, and informal assurances do not meet this standard. This could result in issuing a license to an individual who is legally disqualified, thereby compromising public safety and violating the spirit and letter of the law. Furthermore, an approach that assumes any interaction with law enforcement, regardless of outcome, automatically disqualifies an applicant is also incorrect. The OSTA specifies particular types of offenses and circumstances that lead to disqualification. A blanket disqualification based on any police contact is an overreach and does not accurately reflect the legal requirements. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of all relevant statutory provisions, in this case, the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act. When presented with an applicant's history, the professional must cross-reference that history against each disqualifying factor outlined in the Act. If any potential disqualification is identified, further investigation and verification are necessary to determine the precise legal status and its impact on the applicant's eligibility. This methodical, legally grounded approach ensures both compliance and fairness. Question 18. The control framework reveals an applicant for an Oklahoma handgun license has a documented history of domestic disputes, Which of the following actions best aligns with the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act's requirements for assessing eligibility? Option A. Dismiss the domestic dispute history as irrelevant unless it resulted in a felony conviction, without investigating further into potential misdemeanor domestic abuse offenses or protective orders. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the domestic dispute records to determine if they meet the specific disqualifying criteria for domestic abuse convictions or protective orders as defined by Oklahoma law. Option C. Rely on a personal assessment of the applicant's demeanor during the application process to gauge their suitability for a handgun license, disregarding the domestic dispute history if they appear calm. Option D. Immediately deny the handgun license application upon discovering any mention of domestic disputes, regardless of the outcome or legal disposition. Correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of the domestic dispute records to determine if they meet the specific disqualifying criteria for domestic abuse convictions or protective orders as defined by Oklahoma law. Explanation. The control framework reveals a scenario where an individual seeking to obtain a handgun license in Oklahoma has a history of documented domestic disputes. This presents a professional challenge because Oklahoma law, specifically the Oklahoma Self-Defense Act, OSTA, has explicit provisions regarding the eligibility of individuals with certain criminal histories, including those involving domestic violence, to obtain a handgun license. The careful judgment required stems from balancing the applicant's right to apply with the state's interest in public safety and preventing firearms from falling into the hands of potentially dangerous individuals. Best professional approach involves a thorough and objective review of the applicant's history against the specific disqualifying criteria outlined in the OSTA. This includes verifying the nature and disposition of any domestic dispute records. If the records indicate a conviction for a domestic abuse crime as defined by Oklahoma statutes, or if the applicant has been subject to a protective order that prohibits them from possessing a firearm, they would be disqualified. The OSTA mandates that the licensing authority deny an application if the applicant is disqualified under state law. Therefore, a diligent investigation that adheres strictly to these legal requirements is the correct and legally mandated course of action. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the domestic dispute history without proper investigation, assuming it does not meet the legal threshold for disqualification. This fails to uphold the OSTA intent to prevent firearm possession by individuals with a history of domestic violence, potentially compromising public safety. Another incorrect approach is to deny the license solely based on the existence of a domestic dispute report, without determining if it resulted in a disqualifying conviction or protective order. This could lead to an arbitrary denial of a license to an otherwise eligible individual. Finally, an approach that involves making a subjective judgment about the applicant's current temperament or likelihood of future violence, rather than relying on objective legal criteria, is also professionally unacceptable. Such subjective assessments are not permitted under the OSTA and can lead to biased decision-making. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to statutory requirements. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant legal framework, Oklahoma Self-Defense Act. 2. Gathering all pertinent information regarding the applicant's history. 3. Objectively comparing this information against the specific disqualifying criteria defined in the OSTA. 4. Making a determination based solely on these legal criteria, ensuring fairness and compliance. Question 19. The performance metrics show a slight increase in reported confrontations involving individuals carrying handguns in public spaces across Oklahoma. In a scenario where you are lawfully carrying a handgun and encounter a heated verbal dispute that is escalating, but has not yet involved physical violence or overt threats of serious harm, what is the most prudent course of action to uphold both your rights and legal responsibilities? Option A. Assess the situation for an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, and if none exists, disengage from the confrontation if safely possible, while remaining aware of your surroundings. Option B. Immediately display your handgun to de-escalate the situation and deter further escalation of the dispute. Option C. Assume the situation could quickly turn violent and prepare to draw your handgun to be ready for immediate self-defense. Option D. Intervene verbally to calm the individuals involved, using your presence as a deterrent due to your concealed handgun. The correct answer is A. Assess the situation for an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, and if none exists, disengage from the confrontation if safely possible, while remaining aware of your surroundings. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance the immediate perceived need for self-defense with the legal requirements and responsible firearm handling. The challenge lies in making a rapid, informed decision under potential stress, ensuring that any action taken is both legally permissible and ethically sound, thereby avoiding unnecessary escalation or legal repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately assessing the situation to determine if there is an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death. If such a threat exists, the individual should then consider their legal right to self-defense under Oklahoma law, which permits the use of deadly force when reasonably necessary to protect oneself or another from imminent death or great bodily harm. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and legal compliance, ensuring that any defensive action is a last resort and justifiable under the law. It aligns with the principles of responsible firearm ownership and the legal framework governing self-defense in Oklahoma. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately brandish the handgun at the first sign of a confrontation, even if the threat is not imminent or severe. This action could be interpreted as aggressive and may escalate the situation unnecessarily, potentially leading to legal consequences for brandishing a weapon, even if no shots are fired. It fails to adhere to the principle of using force only when absolutely necessary and justifiable. Another incorrect approach is to assume that having a handgun license automatically grants the right to use the firearm in any perceived threat. This overlooks the crucial legal standard of imminent danger and the proportionality of force required for self-defense under Oklahoma statutes. A license permits lawful carry, not automatic justification for use. A further incorrect approach is to retreat from the situation if a safe avenue of escape is available, even if there is a perceived threat. While Oklahoma law does not impose a strict duty to retreat in all circumstances, particularly in one's home, failing to consider a safe retreat when available, and instead resorting to the use of force, could be viewed unfavorably and may not be considered the most reasonable course of action if the threat was not truly imminent or unavoidable. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that emphasizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and legal knowledge. This involves understanding the specific legal definitions of imminent threat and justifiable force within Oklahoma. Before considering the use of a firearm, one should always evaluate if de-escalation or safe retreat is possible. The decision to use a firearm should be a last resort, based on a reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, and in strict accordance with Oklahoma self-defense laws. Question 20. System analysis indicates a homeowner in Oklahoma legally possesses a handgun and claims it is stored unloaded in a locked safe. The homeowner has 2 young children, aged 7 and 9, who reside in the home. What is the most prudent approach to assessing the overall firearm safety risk in this situation? Option A. Focus solely on whether the firearm is currently unloaded, as this is the primary determinant of immediate safety. Option B. Prioritize assessing the children's awareness of the firearm's existence and location, assuming their knowledge is the most critical factor. Option C. Conduct a thorough risk assessment of the storage environment, evaluating the accessibility of the safe to children, the effectiveness of the locking mechanism, the owner's understanding of safe storage practices, and the potential for unsupervised access, even if the firearm is unloaded. Option D. Accept the homeowner's assurance that the firearm is secure and unloaded, as legal ownership and stated storage methods generally suffice. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough risk assessment of the storage environment, evaluating the accessibility of the safe to children, the effectiveness of the locking mechanism, the owner's understanding of safe storage practices, and the potential for unsupervised access, even if the firearm is unloaded. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving the responsible handling of firearms and the potential for misuse, even when the firearm is legally owned and stored. The core difficulty lies in balancing the owner's right to possess a firearm with the paramount duty to prevent unauthorized access and potential harm to others, particularly minors. Oklahoma law, like many jurisdictions, places a significant emphasis on safe storage to mitigate risks associated with firearms. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a proactive and comprehensive approach to firearm safety, prioritizing the prevention of unauthorized access. This aligns with Oklahoma statutes that emphasize responsible gun ownership and the duty to secure firearms. Specifically, the approach that involves a detailed risk assessment of the storage environment, considering factors like accessibility to children, the presence of safety devices, and the owner's understanding of safe storage practices, is the most effective. This proactive assessment allows for the identification and mitigation of potential hazards before an incident occurs, fulfilling the ethical obligation to prevent harm and adhering to the spirit of Oklahoma's firearm safety regulations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves relying solely on the legal owner's assertion that the firearm is secure without independent verification or a deeper understanding of what constitutes secure storage in a household with children. This fails to acknowledge the inherent risks of even legally owned firearms falling into the wrong hands, especially when minors are present. It neglects the professional responsibility to ensure that secure storage meets objective safety standards, not just subjective owner perception. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the concern because the firearm is legally owned and stored unloaded. While an unloaded firearm is less immediately dangerous, it does not eliminate the risk of unauthorized access, loading, and subsequent misuse. Oklahoma law and general safety principles require more than just being unloaded. They demand measures that actively prevent access by unauthorized individuals, particularly children. A further incorrect approach is to focus only on the immediate presence of children at the time of the assessment, without considering the broader household environment and potential for future unsupervised access. This is a reactive rather than a proactive stance. Professional responsibility demands anticipating potential risks, including situations where children might be left unsupervised with access to the firearm, even if not present at the exact moment of the assessment. Professional reasoning. Professionals tasked with assessing firearm safety in Oklahoma should adopt a risk-based methodology. This involves 1. Identifying potential hazards. What are the specific risks associated with the firearm's presence in this environment? 2. Assessing the likelihood and severity of harm. How likely is unauthorized access and what would be the potential consequences? 3. Evaluating existing controls. What measures are currently in place to mitigate these risks? 4. Determining the need for additional controls. Are the existing controls sufficient, or are further steps required to meet legal and ethical standards? 5. Implementing and monitoring controls, ensuring that recommended safety measures are put in place and remain effective. This systematic process, grounded in a thorough understanding of Oklahoma's firearm safety laws and ethical obligations, ensures a comprehensive and responsible approach to risk management.